In the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to see an increasing use, to answer your question, use of technology, use of artificial intelligence, but we need to make sure that the boundaries are there to actually make sure you control it and the right decisions are made. Using your nuclear deterrent. You wouldn't want AI to have the authority to press the button, but the good leaders actually will turn up unannounced. So they know the strategy they've set, they know the culture they're trying to set, but actually, is it actually happening on the ground? They've stopped using artificial intelligence in certain processes because the human being, they were losing the inability, or they're losing the ability to understand, was the artificial intelligence making the right decisions? You ask them, well, how do you make a decision? And many of them look at you blankly and say, well, what do you mean, how do I make a decision? I just make a decision. I said, what process do you use?
This week, Seumas Kerr. How are you doing?
No? Yeah, very nice to see you, and thank you very much for inviting me this afternoon.
So, to start off with a bit of context, we've known each other a good while. I think you've got a wealth of experience, an insight, multiple insights, no doubt, covering defense, wider industry, infrastructure, and people as well. So, do you want to give us a little background for the audience of what your journey was and where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start right at the beginning just to put it in context. I mean, not like many people, but I mean, I was fortunate. I was locked up at 6 at boarding school till 18. My father, a country vet, wouldn't let me go to university. I wanted to read economics. And actually, without asking me, he collected me and we drove straight to Liverpool and had signed me up in the Merchant Navy as an officer cadet and said, while you're away, read these legal books, read these accountancy books. If you don't know what you want to do when you get back, you'll become an articled accountant or solicitor. Tough love, I think. Had a fantastic time circumnavigating the world. Learned a lot about leadership in some quite difficult positions when a number of people died in incidents. Then started training as a lawyer very, very briefly. And it was actually a £5 bet at a party. I couldn't get into the army. Loved the 3-day assessment at Westbury. Found myself 5 weeks later at Sandhurst. Clearly over-promoted and left as a general after 35 years. And then went into business. And I've been in the infrastructure in the main, doing quite a lot of business development, but also, looking at the moment, for example, global supply chain resilience, looking at critical national infrastructure. So I've loved my 20 years in business equally as much as I love my 35 years in the military. And I think one of the key lessons is it's all about people. And if you're given the opportunity to lead, it's a big responsibility. And I think you can hopefully try and, all of us, make a difference in society.
Well, the particular journey that you had probably gave you skills, which one of the key topics we want to talk about today is critical thinking. How do you look at critical thinking, and what's your observation of how people apply critical thinking in the current age?
I think these days the challenge is, and we've discussed it before, that I don't think there's enough critical thinking, and it's a bit like education at the moment. Our education, a lot of it was actually learning facts, and then you were asked questions, and you then used those facts, you used your thought process to come up with answers. I think these days, education is about teaching young people how to ask the right questions, but then being able to analyze to make sense, particularly using artificial intelligence. Actually, are you being told the truth? How do you make a judgment call? And I think, I translate a lot of what I used in the military, and I've said to friends before, it was almost easier to lead in the military because everybody was trained. They were assessed, you were put in test situations before then. You were put into perhaps real situations, and you were taught how to analyze and come to a decision. So we were all taught right from the outset. If you're looking at, I run at the moment a leadership program for potential chief executives. And in the first 2-day session, you ask them, well, how do you make a decision? And many of them look at you blankly and say, well, what do you mean, how do I make a decision? I just make a decision. But I said, what process do you use? And I say, it doesn't matter what model you use, but you need to have a process how to make a decision. And many of any military friends listening to this, we're taught, what is your aim? And that applies to business. What are your factors you're going to consider? And ideally prioritize those factors. Then what your courses open are with advantages and disadvantages. And then you have to have a written plan. And that written plan has to have very clear targets. It has to have owners. You need to put the money with it. And there needs to be very clear dates when certain things have to be achieved. You can look at a business now, and if they don't have that, if they don't have a strategy, a vision, I believe in putting together a mission, what you're trying to achieve, and then a plan, I think they're going to have real problems.
It seems with the likes of ChatGPT, Gemini, for example, people who haven't had that experience, who are engaging in what they consider problem solving, and conclusions are given to them, that takes out the process of that thinking. So there's no validation of how or why you've come to a conclusion, which ultimately disassociates consequence and impact. I mean, knowing you, I'm aware of numerous experiences that you've had in your life where you have understood the consequences of numerous situations which have hit the headlines from back in your military days, but the people that you advise, if you haven't really considered the consequences, does it take something bad to happen to really understand? Or do you believe that the application of strategy and leadership, so two words which are often overused, but I think overused in the sense that they're taught probably incorrectly because there's no association with impact and consequence. Could you elaborate on that and maybe give us some examples of what it is like to be in that position, to really experience firsthand?
If you look at leadership, and I look at leadership now, there's a different skill set at every level. So I take the tactical level of leadership. When you're taught how to lead a team of about 40. Now, it could be in the military, or it could be in the infrastructure sector, in the built environment. The same principles apply, and it's a key skill. And if you look at industry at the moment, take the infrastructure sector, quite often you'll promote the best electrician to be a leader, but he or she hasn't been trained to lead, and they're uncomfortable and they fail. So I'm a great believer that you need to train people at every level. So if you're successful at that level, you need to build up your experience. I think you also need people to also look at, as you've alluded to there, what are the consequences of your decision? What is the worst case, and how do you mitigate it? And I think all businesses will have a risk matrix, and they should have owners of that risk matrix. And I think it's acceptable to take a risk, and you're going to have to take risk. But actually, you should know then when you go to gamble and what the consequences of gamble are. And gambling is, you could lose everything. If you bet on the horses or whatever else you might bet on, I always look at, I don't actually bet, but if you're going to, perhaps the Grand National occasionally, you put £10 on, I'm almost giving it away. If I win something, fantastic, but I'm not assuming I'm going to. So I think you need to, I'll give us some examples in a minute, but if you look at that tactical level of to begin with. And then actually, if you progress in your career, you're going to begin to lead leaders. And the term I use for that is the operational level of leadership. And I'll come back to perhaps the military. At about 30, we select the top 10%. And I think businesses tend to do the same on their fast stream as you go through your careers. So you're beginning to promote people to young directors who'll be leading other people. And it's getting people to understand that. I always try and look at life. It's whatever I do. I haven't worked in my life. I only do what I like doing. And if it's a way of life, you enjoy it, you have a passion about it, you're not working, you don't work. But we're very privileged to be able to say that. But again, it's a very different skill set when you're actually leading leaders. And I think from the minute you come into, you're teaching people, if you come into a business, from the moment you speak to the receptionist, to go in to meet your friends and colleagues, to when you're dealing with your directors and you're leading upwards at the same time to the board. But you need to understand that actually you are leading every minute of the day. And then the final level is that strategic level, when actually, I'm talking about the chief exec, chairman of companies, when you need to understand the geopolitical situation that your country is operating in. And therefore you probably, let's say you're in London, you need to know ministers, the prime minister. If you're operating in a country, you need to know the leaders of those countries to make sure that you're making the very best decisions for your company. And therefore, it comes back to that bit about having a vision for your business, a mission, and a plan. Once all that's there with owners and targets, then you can actually run your business. I work for a very large construction company. We had a brilliant leader as the chief executive, but he hadn't been prepared to go on into that next position. And it quite often happens, you see it in business, where people are brilliant at what they do, but you should be sending them away to Harvard, Princeton, whatever, to actually get a whole group of friends who are fellow chief executives to be able to assist you then. It's a very lonely place at the top of a company.
We often find in technology, someone who's great at innovation, a great developer, may end up going through the ranks. But the psychology and the nature of developers, it tends to be very focused, very isolated, mission orientated on their particular task, but will rise up and by default be put into a position of leadership when that is not instinctively what they love, what they're good at, what their core skill sets. In many ways, from a military perspective, the people who are on particular operations or on a particular unit could be great at what they do, could be world class at what they do, but do they understand everything around them, the supporting infrastructure, the wider level, or is it very specific? And it's easy to come to a conclusion that you perhaps know a bit more than you do. And that it's almost, I'm not saying specifically in the military, but that's where you can silo. But in business, it's, do you know what you don't know, or do you not know what you don't know?
Yeah.
And it's usually the latter which catches you out.
But I think that's whereby it's making sure, if you're operating at that level, that actually the chairman is responsible for running the company. The day-to-day stuff is the chief executive. He or she, and they will have their board with them, their non-exec directors with them. And it's, I think, making sure that your board has diversity, not only gender, and ethnic, I mean, the visible signs, but actually that they've got cognitive diversity, and you encourage people to challenge you. I mean, ultimately, as a leader, it is your responsibility to make that decision. But I think that's why the relationship between chief executive and chairman is so important to get that right. And I think it's also important that you have a mentor. And also, I think these days, the importance of having a reverse mentor, that actually you are also getting the views of the younger generation as you lead going on. And I think that's so important. And then to walk the talk. I can remember being managing director of a company, and once a month I would, it was in the infrastructure sector, would actually put on a boiler suit and go back to the floor. I couldn't do the work, I would carry the tools, but it was actually to understand what it was like and what the constraints were at that level. And many of the chief executives of big businesses do that. They'll turn up unannounced. I don't know, in the retail sector, it could be, doesn't matter whether it's Tesco, Sainsbury's, whatever, but the good leaders actually will turn up unannounced. So they know the strategy they've set, they know the culture they're trying to set, but actually, is it actually happening on the ground? And we've seen an incident only on the news this morning, it broke last night, about the Metropolitan Police and culture. And I do believe the commissioner is trying to set the right culture. Over 120 policemen have been removed, but clearly it's not been inculcated into the organisation yet.
I mean, it's fascinating to see from the outside and from the inside the same action for two different reasons. For example, I mean, someone we have in common and know, this particular individual has an credible ability to communicate on the same level with almost anyone in any walk of life, whether it's a prime minister or a squaddy or just someone in any walk of life. It's that ability to relate. Now, if you get a real leader and that leader turns up anyway and communicates with everyone and anyone to understand what's happening, or if you put a camera there, is it for the optics? And it could be the same action, but the motivating factor is completely different. And it really comes down to, well, one's doing it because he's listening or she's listening, and the other person is doing it to give the impression they're listening. And usually the end consequence doesn't favor the one who does it for optics. But culturally and societally, if you look at the impact of social media over a long period of time, the impact that has had on daily life, in business, in the relationship between employers and people coming into employment, how people behave in a very common manner. And this is where AI is kind of intersecting to amplify the potential positive and potentially very negative elements of, are we listening? Are employers listening? Are employees listening? Are we listening to younger people? Are we listening to older people with experience? And how does that all connect? A common theme that I hear from guests on the podcast is a CFO will say AI is a great opportunity to reduce headcount. That's the wrong motivating factor. When you look at it, human beings, which have a lifetime of experience, who understand how things work, how relationships work, how their industries work, are actually of incredible value. And what AI could do is allow those people to do more of what they know and to do better on scale. And it's really then, are the politicians listening? Are business leaders listening? Are everyday people listening? Because that all ends up with, well, what's the plan? What's the strategy? And how do we implement it? Given we're talking about the uncertainty of the global economy.
I mean, I think we all have to embrace artificial intelligence. It's a wonderful opportunity. I don't think we should fear, and many people write and you hear it spoken about, that it's going to put people out of work. I think people are just going to be doing a different type of work, and probably something that's intellectually more challenging than perhaps what they're doing now. But going back to the beginning of that last kind of bit of conversation we had, I think society now, it should be about we, not me. And I try very hard not to think about me, but I go back to my father's generation, that bit of tough love at the front, right at the beginning where we started speaking. But he was taught, he was a country vet, that at university you let your hair down. That's where you have some fun. You learn your profession, but was always told when you go to your first town, you are going to be a leader of society. And, the local councillors were doctors, dentists, vets, accountants, the town clerk, the head teacher, the bank manager. And they felt a responsibility for society. They don't anymore. I mean, some do, of course, but generally, we're looking at, trying to just look after ourselves, whereas actually those people who are privileged, as well as the people who are in business, I'm a great believer in serve to lead. It's a great privilege to be a leader, and therefore you have to accept that responsibility. And actually, it's trying to get the very best out of society. And as I said, we need to embrace artificial intelligence, but you need to make sure that actually you have the control measures in place to make sure that it's not actually running your life and running away and making the wrong decisions. And you shouldn't be lazy. So, I mean, in business, I was speaking to a big accountancy company, one of the big consultancies. They've stopped using artificial intelligence in certain processes because the human being, they were losing the inability, or they're losing the ability to understand, was the artificial intelligence making the right decisions?
Because it's almost a false economy that's been occurring. I mean, that's consistent with everything we're hearing. And it doesn't matter what walk of life people are from. I think this really is presented as a human problem. And what I would love to be able to do on the podcast is present a way of thinking, or present the opportunity for people to think differently, but in reality, not differently. Differently in the sense of different to the current short-term thinking, which is more the optics driven, and actually think like we've always thought to create successful outcomes. So it's the same in music. A really good artist understands his success, or their success, is by appreciating the fact that they serve an audience. If they do not entertain, if they do not provide something of personal emotional value on a person-by-person basis, well, they're not rewarded, and then they don't have successful sales. There's an intrinsic link between successful outcomes and the inputs. Around that, and people, I use music because, I'm experienced in that. But you think of the one big artist, I could name every single person around them that the public wouldn't be aware of. The entire team of people. It is, in fact, far more like a military operation, and you only see the net result after years of training. That's if you could look at that like an apprenticeship. You could look at that in a senior leadership role, even from a C-suite. How do all of the individuals managing divisions, departments, provide value and work as a team, to the orchestrator, the CEO. And as you said, being a CEO is a very lonely place. But it's really all of these base stakes in the ground. Nothing's changed. That's the reality.
But I think it's coming into humility. I think is so important. It's an accident of birth where we start in life.
Absolutely.
It's an accident of birth how much intellect or your IQ, how high or low it is. But actually, if you're a good person, and you were using music as an example, but it's exactly the same in business, that actually he or she, if they have all those right attributes and they've done what I've spoken beforehand, and then actually they walk the talk, they do it all the time. And actually, it's a bit like you've got to be able to relax and have a joke with your staff. You actually, if you go on a visit to a site, clearly, you shouldn't walk past anything that's wrong, but people should feel good after that leader has left. They've learned something, they've had a greater understanding of what the business is trying to achieve, and I think that's why having the right vision is so important. And I think integrity and telling the truth. Nobody wants to hear just good news, because actually you tend not to believe it. We've got a challenging situation in the country at the moment, and we need great leaders to be able to get us out of the position we're in at the moment. And we've touched on being totally apolitical, but politicians should be running the country as a business, and they need to lead. And I think it's a bit like different stages in the year. Winston Churchill was a brilliant wartime leader. He wasn't necessarily a brilliant peacetime leader. And it's a bit like, great in business, certain people are very good at leading in challenging situations. When it gets to steady state, they get bored. And therefore, it's probably the right thing that they do their 5-year term or 10-year term and then move on.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying before. What are you good at? And contextually, do you put your best foot forward? And things change, things evolve, or humans evolve. So the nature of a team, the nature of growth and developing opportunity and innovation, sustaining and maintaining something is a completely different skill set to building it from scratch. I know from startups, you start with nothing, literally something here, and hopefully X number of years later, you're employing numerous people. It's feeding them and their kids. Their customers are happy because they are receiving value. So they have that's the transaction of business. So I have a need. I value the thing that you're selling. It solves the problem. It's the base fundamentals of critical thinking, and of course, it's so wide and varied, and on different scales. But the fundamentals are effectively the same.
Well, and I think as well, as a leader, you never stop learning. I was very fortunate to be hosting a dinner the other night, and I'm a great fan of his, Javier Hishava, who is the COO for Heathrow Airport, and he was the chief finance officer beforehand. Heathrow is a village of 76,000 people. There's hundreds of millions of flights, flying each year, and he had to deal with that power outage they had recently. And for various reasons, the chief executive couldn't be got hold of, and these things happen. It happens on operations in the military. It happens in business, and he had to deal with it. And he went through his decision process of how he got to take the decision to say, right, actually, we're going to close the airport for 24 hours. It might be ready in 12. It might be ready in 18. It could be ready in 6. But actually, he understood the bigger picture. He understood the geopolitics of it because there were flights coming in from
Made global news.
all over the world.
Yeah.
But actually, what he enabled to do by making that decision of saying we will close for 24 hours, and this has been in the press, it meant that people could plan. And actually, it was ready beforehand, but actually, it probably had the least impact. And they will look at why things happened afterwards. But that is what successful training is. Successful leadership, that the chief executive wasn't available, but actually his number two dealt with it. And that's what success is all about.
Well, it leads to another point, which alludes to a number of elements we've spoken about, and communication. Communication in the daily practice, communicating so that you can hear views, you can put proper strategies in place, you can understand. We've seen with what we've done over the last decade, the amount of times information was within an organization, something happened, but the people that dealt with it hadn't had any form of communication with the people that knew the answers or were aware. So you consistently would see negative consequences repeated time and time again. And from the outside, observing an entire organization, you'd think, well, nearly every time something went wrong, someone in the organization knew, but it hadn't been communicated. There was staff turnover, plans existed but weren't communicated, and or there wasn't value associated because things were too siloed. And again, alluding to what could AI do positively, enabling better fluidity of communication, but communicating consequence. Often things can go wrong. Somebody asked me recently, well, what is resilience? Now, what's the best way to prevent your location getting hit by a tsunami? Pick a location 200 foot higher.
Yeah.
Now that sounds silly, but that's a building services, that's the property division. Well, they may look at a building and go, this is the ideal location. But not if you haven't listened to everyone in the organization and said, well, it is, but it's not for that. Do you have the appetite for that bad thing going wrong? No, we don't. Okay, well, if you just don't have the appetite, don't
But
choose
that's
there.
why I think your risk register is so important. And I'm a great believer in putting people through scenarios in advance.
But again, that's
So,
communication.
it's
That's
communication.
discussion.
Well, and also within an organization, making sure that there are standing operating procedures so that there is a way to do it. I think as a leader as well, I mean, the military use a term, but it's used increasingly in business, and you've heard me use it already, is they use the term mission command. So set a mission, but actually by doing that, tell people what they have to achieve and not what they have, how to do it. Because then you get the very best out of people and you allow them to use their initiative. And that's at every possible level. I mean, there are certain things like, health and safety has to be complied with, but don't let that constrain your business. It has to be in place. It's important to look after people, but actually then let people use their initiative and move forward.
Because that's effectively why. Why have health and safety? Well, to avoid negative consequences. And it really goes into the heart from an education standpoint, which translates into employment as well, and effectively business. And this is going to be a worldwide issue. It already is becoming that. If you shortcut from A to B, and you're asked the question, or the task is to get to B, and AI helps you get A to B quickly, but you don't know why, then it's the wrong side of mission control?
Command.
Mission command.
Yeah.
And that's the type of thing we see within law firms which have adopted AI to create efficiencies. And the illusion of creating efficiencies doesn't really create efficiencies. As you said, like, one of the organizations you've worked with,
Yeah.
they're looking at it thinking, well, and we've seen it with a number, which are banning the use of certain AI because it's effectively stopping people understanding what their job is.
Well,
So
we touched on earlier, prior to this conversation, that say you're using your nuclear deterrent, you wouldn't want AI to have the authority to press the button. I think there has to be an interface at that stage to enable a human being, he or she, to make that decision. But also, I touched on earlier, when your back is against the wall, that's why I think mental resilience is so important. And as a leader, actually, you need to make sure you do not get tired.
yeah,
There's no point having the hugely industrious idiot who just creates work. One needs to ask yourself all the time, am I adding value? I'm not creating unnecessary work. Use artificial intelligence, but you need to have the judgment and experience. And having gone through that, aim, factors, courses, open plan. If you've done that, you've just written it down very quickly so you understand beforehand. But actually, when you're really up against it and you need to make a decision, it's a competitive world, isn't it? And therefore, you can't always go that steady process. You need to actually understand that actually I can afford to use AI, take some time out, take some process out. And it's that bit about business acumen. I mean, the German use the term Fingerspitzel. What is right? How does that allow me to make the decision? And I can remember doing a paper at one stage because I was just interested. I was doing my FCIPD, Fellow of Chartered Institute of Personal Development, comparing leadership in business with leadership in the military. And I asked 40 chief execs in my primary research, just give me your top 8 requirements you think of your strategic leaders or what are required. And the military, it has theirs written down. They were very, very similar. But a couple of instances where it was different was that on the military side, and you alluded to it earlier, they spoke about you have to have the ability, he or she, to be able to communicate to their organization.
yeah,
And also the military emphasized the power of decision making. Now, you've got to be able to make a decision. And sometimes it's more important to make the decision to allow your organization to move forward. You have to accept that sometimes you're going to be wrong.
But if you're informed, I mean, this is one of the incredible strengths of the right type of AI. And AI as a term, and going back to the education element, what would like to afford and share with the audience, AI is such a generic term. It's so wide ranging. There are so many different types of AI, and to lump all of them in the same space is technically, I think, incorrect. So if people in charge of adopting AI and making business decisions can look at, for example, GraphRag based
Yes.
AI with machine learning, that has an incredible capability to provide context and assess information on scale for that exact purpose, for making informed decisions and making the decisions, rather than another form of AI, transformer-based large language models, which is almost taking an excuse and saying, well, I don't really understand and I don't want to take the responsibility, so it'll come up with something. So it goes back to the same circumstance where one person goes because they really want to understand and make decisions, and the other one wants to be seen to be looking like they understand but doesn't really want to make a decision. That it's adopting the right type of artificial intelligence and taking the little bit of time to say, well, this is ideal for the organization. This will help make better decisions, more informed decisions to progress and move forward. Because we're going to end up in a position, again, we discussed before, the amount from the UK, how many unemployed there are in the UK, and without getting political, it's quite obvious to see how we're ending up in this position. And you could argue it's nothing to do with, or it wasn't anything to do with AI, particularly in the beginning, but there is a change. And as a country with a large number of unemployed people, the AI is the topic to say, we'll create efficiencies, the story being sold, it'll take people's jobs. I don't believe that necessarily to be the case.
Going back to where that conversation was, that you run a business, you're leading an army, you're running the country, and something I don't understand is if you're running the country as a business, what you need to set first of all about what is your industrial strategy. Where does your nation earn its income that it actually needs? Where are the greatest business opportunities? AI can produce that for you.
Yeah.
You then need to call in business leaders to make sure it's right, but they could ascertain that's right. If you've done that first, you would then actually look at, right, what does my foreign policy have to be to enable that to take place? Because foreign policy is an enabler. And then afterwards then, right, the number one priority of any nation is the defense and security of the nation. And therefore, how do I enable that industrial strategy and foreign policy to protect that and project the power of a nation to enable it to happen? And you join the armed forces not to fight, but actually to be strong to ensure there is peace. And that's, being non-political again, that issue, you see figures in the press. You can use artificial intelligence to check, but again, 9.2 million people unemployed. No business can afford to carry 20% of its workforce unemployed receiving payments. And then the other bit we touched on is that we're spending over 50% of our GDP on the National Health Service, welfare and pensions. That has to be addressed because actually no country can carry that. Why aren't we using, it's not a political statement, a system like the French or the Germans, when in the National Health Service, everybody receives something free if you earn less than 25,000, but everybody else pays a small bit of insurance. And using artificial intelligence, you could help get those 9.2 million people back to work.
Because there's also the education side.
Yeah.
And if things have not been addressed for a while and we're not helping people get to the position where, I mean, if the attitude is AI can do it when it can't really do it, when we're not encouraging critical thinking, we're not providing roadmaps to get people into a position where they can innovate, they can create, they can participate, they can learn, they can understand. It really goes back to the leadership thing.
But that comes back to, I think, us having a responsibility. We are privileged. We have now, sadly, a lot of broken homes. But these things happen, but we need to help and motivate them. I mean, and I think a lot of it starts with education, right from the importance. I've been lucky enough to travel around the world. We as a family lived in Pakistan for a year, in Baluchistan on the Afghan border. People had absolutely nothing. But education was such a high priority for them. You see it in Africa. Young kids will walk 10 miles to get to school and sit around one laptop in a classroom because they see as education is the way forward. I mean, it's part of the rise and fall of nations. We've got young people who don't see the importance of education. And We as a society need to address that, and we are failing. They need to understand why education is so important. I mean, I'm chairman of the Pakistan Society for the UK, and one of the things we're doing is putting in place to raise money to pay for young Pakistani girls from disadvantaged backgrounds to do open university degrees. Because actually, we've taken the view, we've consulted, that will make such a big difference, because education is a way forward in society. It enables you to have the confidence to use artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And you look at the first, second, third, fourth industrial revolution, everybody says it's going to put people out of work. It doesn't, does it? People do different things.
Because there's opportunity. I mean, this is where it's very interesting, and it's where there is, for everyone out there, irrespective of what their interest is, the things that make businesses work are customers, right? If you don't have any customers, you don't have a business, right? And for everything that has been super successful historically, it's not thinking the same as everybody else. It's thinking a little bit differently and seeing the thing that other people don't, and then working hard and creating something of value. I mean, these are really base fundamentals, and obviously everything is being built around that. There's the leadership element, the strategic element, but there is incredible opportunity for, well, all people, but especially for young people, to redefine what could be. And
Well, I think we need to give them an opportunity. I think when you're negotiating with somebody, ideally there's a win-win for both. If you look at the awful situation we've got, well, we had in the Balkans, we've now got in Ukraine at the moment. Somehow, I mean, I won't put my personal views forward, but for them to negotiate peace, there has to be a win-win. But you can't let the bully win, and therefore there have to be some consequences. But I think there will be a way forward, and and we're learning a lesson at the moment, aren't we?
so, I mean, that brings up a topic which it would be great to get your view on. And again, my view is, whilst AI will be great, and equally there will be terrible things from it as well, there will be opportunity, but there's equally huge risk. Your experience, which I think is very, very valuable, having been a general in now His Majesty's, it was Her Majesty's Armed Forces. What's the outlook from a UK perspective and an international perspective, from a defense perspective, infusing how AI is changing it, but whether it's not necessarily AI that is creating the change, but it's definitely changing how things are done. For example, we've seen in Ukraine the impact of drones on war. So it's not so much about the technology, it's the position that we're at. What does the next 1 to 3 years look like, and how do you see things
Well,
changing?
I think technology is advancing all the time, and artificial intelligence is advancing all the time, and therefore I think the military has to invest in both of those and embrace both of those. I think what we're seeing in Ukraine, we were drones. I think that in war, you get some fascinating examples, but I compare business with the military. Business is at war all the time. I don't mean that fighting, but it's competitive. Unless you're the best, you're not going to realize the very best opportunities for your business. And therefore, coming back to the military, I mean, some of the lessons that are coming out at the moment, that is actually procurement in wartime can be done very, very quickly. And therefore, can we replicate that in peace? my personal view, and I think it's accepted coming out of the Strategic Defence Review, that our armed services are too small, and there are plans to increase the size, but also to embrace technology, or not necessarily fight wars as they've been fought in the past, and therefore to think differently. Space is so important, but actually ultimately people are important, and therefore, how do you make sure that you have the right people? They enjoy the experience. There are some recruiting problems at the moment in the armed forces, but actually, so the experience when you're serving has to be very beneficial. But like anything, you look at the end-to-end process. Does the recruiting work? Is the training work? Is the lived experience work? And then as and when you leave, to have the confidence that there are jobs to go to, because they finish quite early and they're going to go on for their nation. So I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to see an increasing use, to answer your question, use of technology, use of artificial intelligence, but we need to make sure that the boundaries are there, to actually make sure you control it and the right decisions are made. So whether you inculcate some values into your decision making, into your artificial intelligence, so that lines aren't crossed, but human beings then need to be able to be taught how to fight in that environment. And the armed forces are preparing themselves for that. That's how the Strategic Defence Review was written. It then needs, this is not a political decision, it needs funding, it needs a very detailed plan and targets to be able to take it forward for the next 3 years. So I think people know what has to be achieved, but like anything, you actually need to have the how to get there, otherwise you falter.
They're common themes, really.
Yeah.
Education, thinking properly, putting people first, embracing opportunity, and reducing risk.
I just think actually we are, perhaps people say I'm overly optimistic, but I think we live in a wonderful country and we have huge opportunities and we don't realize it. And I think we need business leaders are going to create that opportunity for the nation. And we've always been, we operate on the geopolitical stage, and therefore I think we need to get ourselves in a position where we are respected on the world stage. We understand the role that we play, and I think that is, going back to that bit, understanding your industrial strategy, your foreign policy, and then actually how do your defense forces support that. If we can get that right, we have huge opportunities. We always have challenges, and that happens for any nation, but you can tell it's something I feel passionate about. But I think you summed it up when you said there at the end, people are so important, but we need leaders who serve and understand that importance, but embrace technology, embrace artificial intelligence to make ourselves as competitive as possible.
I think you've put that very succinctly. I think it's, you always have incredibly valuable insights, and I think it's refreshing for people to hear and to see all of these topics put into a very cohesive way of thinking, and there's a huge amount of value. So I appreciate you coming on and appreciate your insights and your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.
Great.
Thank you, Seumas.